The law of unintended consequences is an unforgiving master to those who specialize in predicting the course of international relations. Russian President Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine in February 2022 surprised most international observers and the Biden administration. Not many, if any, in the ranks of veteran diplomats, think tank denizens, and journalists who make up the foreign policy establishment thought the illegal act of aggression would turn into an increasingly bloody stalemate into which much of the rest of the world would be drawn. The question now facing these supposedly smart people is what will be the implications of a decision on the part of the United States and its European allies to escalate the already destructive war by giving the Ukrainians tanks, jets, and any other high-tech armaments they want in order to give them a chance to achieve the complete defeat of the nuclear power with which they are locked in combat. Another factor that must be taken into account is the increasing likelihood that China will think it is in its interest to seek to balance the massive American commitment to Ukraine. Beijing may be coming to the conclusion that it is necessary for it to come to the aid of its ally in Moscow by sending arms that will ensure that the fighting will continue indefinitely. But another issue is at play. What is the effect of this great power proxy war on Iran? With the Biden administration treating support for Ukraine as its foreign policy and security priority, many of its critics have questioned whether the territorial integrity of that country is really a U.S. national interest, let alone the most important thing going on in the world. That decision is defended as the only way to prevent further Russian acts of aggression. It's also seen as a way to deter China, which remains America's most potent potential enemy. But it's unclear whether the laser focus on Ukraine and the stripping of U.S. armed forces of armaments in order to feed Kyiv's insatiable demand for supplies to keep fighting Russia, with no serious effort underway to increase military spending or to start a new American arms buildup, is actually undermining American efforts to deter Chinese aggression against Taiwan. Even less attention is being paid to whether one of the unintended consequences of the West's obsession with Ukraine is the help it may provide to Iran. Though the despotic regime in Tehran is beset by a protest movement that it hasn't been able to completely suppress, it too has become part of the drama in Ukraine by supplying Moscow with the drones and the personnel to train its forces to use them. More than that, it has apparently become even more closely allied with Putin after a decade in which Russia played a largely equivocal role in the world's efforts to prevent Iran from gaining a nuclear weapon, sometimes aiding the theocratic regime and resupplying it with weaponry, and sometimes seeking to restrain it. Even in Syria, where the two countries were allies in a joint war to preserve the barbarous regime of President Bashar Assad, the Russians played both ends against the middle. Russia used the horrendous civil war in that country to reassert its status as a Middle Eastern power after former President Barack Obama famously punted on his red line threat to punish Assad for using chemical weapons against his own people and deputized Putin to deal with the problem. That enabled Russia to further establish itself in Syria with air and naval bases that it used to aid Assad and the Iranians in their bloody efforts to suppress the rebels. But Moscow also was careful not to let the Iranians have a free hand there, signaling their acquiescence to Israel's repeated airstrikes on Iranian and Hezbollah targets in Syria. Some may see Iran's decision to throw in its lot with Russia as the act of a desperate regime on the wrong side of history, as well as a mistake that will result in it becoming further isolated and ultimately weakened. That would be a positive development, since Iran's push for regional hegemony in the Middle East via its terrorist auxiliaries and its long-term effort to attain nuclear status make it a uniquely dangerous and destabilizing force in the world, not to mention an existential threat to Israel. However, the scenario by which Iran loses as a result of its growing ties with Russia requires a belief that the escalating Western involvement in Ukraine will lead to Russia's complete defeat and collapse, in addition to striking a blow to China's ability to exercise its increasingly potent influence on the world stage. Those who are pushing for America to go all in on an effort to not merely defend Ukraine's right to self-determination, but to defeat Russia and topple Putin, believe they are trying to make the world a safer and better place. Still, they need to take into consideration the very real possibility that this massive spending and arms aid project will fail to accomplish those goals, and that the ratcheting up of the fighting will both needlessly worsen the humanitarian disaster that Putin unleashed and create an even bloodier stalemate that will make Russia's allies stronger. Rather than falling, as some thought would happen when the protests began last fall, the Iranian regime is still in place and now receiving high-profile support from China, an emerging superpower that the United States is still not truly taking seriously or willing to stand up to, as the recent farce with Beijing spy balloons demonstrated. The international community's focus on aiding Ukraine, treating its President Volodymyr Zelensky as the second coming of Winston Churchill, and embracing the cause of driving the Russians out, not just of all the territory they seized last year, but to restore the borders of the country to what they were in 2014 before Putin took parts of eastern Ukraine and Crimea, has pushed every other foreign policy issue to the margins in the last 12 months. Prior to the invasion, President Joe Biden's foreign policy priority was his effort to entice Iran to re-enter the nuclear deal that his old boss had struck with Tehran in 2015. His diplomatic team offered terms that would have created an even weaker pact. Rather than stopping Iran's nuclear quest, it would have guaranteed its eventual manufacturing of a weapon. But sensing Biden's weakness, a factor that also emboldened Putin to launch his invasion, demonstrated in his disgraceful retreat from Afghanistan, the Iranians stonewalled him. With the Iranians aiding the Russians, even Biden knows that there will be no new nuclear deal with Iran. And while the administration understands that Tehran is closer than ever to being able to build a bomb, officials like CIA Director William Burns remain unprepared to fully acknowledge the threat or talk tough about it, let alone join the Israelis in posing a credible military threat to ensure that such a nightmare scenario never comes to pass. Biden spent the week of the one-year anniversary of the war patting himself on the back for rallying the West behind Ukraine and putting Zelensky in a position to at least avoid defeat, if not outright win the war. That position has considerable support in his party, most of whose members have finally found a war they can love because they identify Ukraine with their hate for former President Donald Trump and have become convinced that Putin is not just a terrible and dangerous dictator, which he is, but another Adolf Hitler. It's also supported by the Republican Party's Washington establishment that sees the conflict through the lens of outdated Cold War or Bush-era war on terror perspectives. What they are not taking into account is the very real possibility that escalating the war in Ukraine will have troubling unintended consequences that will allow Iran, as well as China, to emerge from this disaster in an even stronger position than they were a year ago. Biden could choose to push for a compromise solution that, while falling short of Zelensky's ambitions, will mean Ukrainian independence and end the suffering and devastation visited on his country. By choosing instead to back the Ukrainian belief in victory over Russia, he's not just risking an Armageddon World War III scenario with a nuclear power that has no intention of being toppled or defeated. By choosing to continue a war whose outcome he can't control, he's also laying the foundations for an endless and unwinnable conflict that will increase Beijing's influence in Russia. That might also enable Iran to survive its current domestic troubles, and, with even more help from a Chinese regime eager to weaken the West and its friends, become even more powerful in the Middle East. The anniversary of the war in Ukraine is a moment when all decent people should be focused on ending the suffering there, and not just venting their outrage at Putin. But the longer the war continues without a decisive result, powers like China and Iran will move to fill certain vacuums and up their ante as they seek to profit from the spoils. Well-meaning Americans should ponder the ramifications of their crush on Zelensky, and a belief that this is a war that should be fought relentlessly to ensure Russia's collapse, no matter how high the price for that might be. Just as a stronger Iran was an unintended consequence of America's invasion of Iraq, the same might be the result of Washington's blind commitment to a forever war in Ukraine. U.S. leaders need to ask themselves if they are thinking seriously about whether this policy will not only fail to accomplish those goals, but make the world a more dangerous place in which Putin will survive while China and Iran grow more
Tonight, Congress is putting the spotlight on deteriorating U.S. relations with China and the growing threat that the communist regime poses to the United States. The first hearing of the new House Select Committee on China begins in the next hour. Let's bring in CNN's Jessica Dean. She's up on Capitol Hill for us. Also, let's bring in CNN's David Culver, who has reported from China for years. Jessica, I'll start with you. Tell us what to expect at tonight's hearing.
Well, Wolf, this is the first primetime hearing for any GOP-led committee since they took over the majority in January. So this is high-stakes stuff. And it's worth noting that this is a very bipartisan committee, and it enjoys a tremendous amount of bipartisan support. So that's kind of the tone and tenor as we head into this evening's primetime hearing. We're expecting them to tackle 4 key issues. Among them, the spy balloon, the Chinese spy balloon, COVID-19, China's support of Russia in its fight against Ukraine, and then also the future of TikTok. There's also going to be a host of witnesses that will be testifying in tonight's hearing. And among those will be Matthew Pottinger. He's the former Deputy National Security Advisor and also a widely renowned Chinese expert. We're told that he's going to play a video that is aimed at dispelling any questions about the ambitions of the Chinese government. We're also expected to hear from former National Security Advisor under former President Donald Trump, H.R. McMaster, on this issue as well. And both of these men widely respected across the aisle. So we will anticipate they will walk people through and walk the members of Congress through what threats America faces right now. And Wolf, one more thing that's worth noting today, just to kind of set the stage, is that the Biden administration warned today that any Chinese firm or person that provides lethal aid to Russia in its fight against Ukraine will be targeted by the U.S. government. Wolf?
All right, Jessica, stand by. David, you're now in Washington, but you're a veteran of covering China over these years. What's your take on this hearing tonight and its significance?
Well, Wolf, this shifts the attention onto the Chinese Communist Party in particular, rather than just China as a whole. And this likely is going to call out the party's actions within China, especially with regards to human rights. Now, among the most sensitive issues is the widespread allegations of human rights abuses against the Uyghur, the ethnic Muslim minority. And we've actually traveled to Xinjiang. We've reported on that firsthand. The party also faces criticism for its harsh crackdown on dissent, including any pro-democracy movements. We saw that with Hong Kong. Now, the Chinese government often will fire back at that criticism. They point to issues with race or police brutality in the U.S., and they tell American politicians, hey, mind your business. But it's precisely because of that business that we need to care about this. The U.S. companies with either supply chain or a massive consumer base in China have, and they're going to continue to be challenged with having to place these moral decisions above profits. It is a really tricky balance. And you anger China, you risk financial loss. You go against the U.S., you face potentially being alienated here at home. Wolf, this committee is going to no doubt be focused on any alleged atrocity committed by the party and put that pressure on American companies doing business in China. And that's where most of us here could feel that trickle-down effect. Wolf?
All right, thanks very much, David Culver, Jessica Dean, guys. Appreciate it very much. Let's go to Ukraine right now. President Volodymyr Zelensky is warning that fighting in the key eastern city of Bakhmut is growing more and more challenging right now. CNN's Alex Marquardt is joining us live from eastern Ukraine. Alex, so what are you seeing on the ground? What are you hearing from Ukrainian forces about this situation in the east?
Well, Wolf, such fierce fighting here in eastern Ukraine with so much of that focus on the battle for Bakhmut that has been raging for the past several months. President Volodymyr Zelensky is saying tonight that that is the most difficult fight. The Ukrainian forces are coming under increasingly intense assaults, that Russian forces are showing little regard for their men and suffering huge casualties. Wolf, CNN did reach out and speak with a soldier, a Ukrainian soldier in Bakhmut earlier today, who said that the situation is so tough that it is 100% more difficult than Ukrainian officials are willing to admit. But this same soldier is saying that they are not going to surrender, they are not going to give up this city without a fight. In the meantime, Russia appears to be making some gains. The Russian force has been primarily made up in and around Bakhmut with those mercenaries and convicts from the Wagner Group. They have been backed up by the Russian regular military. They do appear to have taken some territory north of Bakhmut as they try to encircle the city. Ukraine does appear to be on its heels, but resisting those intense assaults by the Russians. This fight has been in such close quarters in and around the city, in the trenches, street to street, house to house. Russian forces pounding Ukrainian defensive positions, not only with artillery, but at night with combat jets, combat aircraft, to the point where one Ukrainian commander says that the Russians are trying to pound the city of Bakhmut into molecules. Wolf?
Alex Marquardt, be careful over there. We'll stay in close touch with you. Thank you very much. As this war in Ukraine rages on, Vladimir Putin is making a rare admission of battlefield losses. CNN's Matthew Chance is joining us. He has the latest on that. Tell us, Matthew, more about Putin's speech to his own security service today.
Yeah, this is an important speech because Vladimir Putin, of course, was the head of this agency, the FSB, the former KGB. And so what he says to them is usually very frank and direct. Only a proportion of it was in the public sphere. The rest of it was behind closed doors. And basically, this was Vladimir Putin essentially instructing the FSB, the main security service inside Russia, to up its game when it comes to counterintelligence inside Russia in the face of what he said was increased Ukrainian and Western, including United States, efforts to carry out espionage and sabotage activities inside the country. Putin talking about the need for secrecy around particular areas like the defense industry, like personal data, like the command and control systems of the Russian military. He didn't point to any particular intelligence failures, but the fact that he was talking about these things sort of, points to a certain concern about vulnerabilities inside the country. Now, since Russia invaded Ukraine over a year ago now, it has been subject, remember, to numerous attacks inside the country. There has been, drone attacks on railway infrastructure, recruitment offices for the military have been burned down. There have been cyber attacks as well. So it may be a reference to that sort of thing. There was also this rare reference to the fact that the FSB has been taking part in what Russia calls its special military operation and has suffered casualties as well. Take a listen to what Vladimir Putin had to say.
Unfortunately, there are losses in our ranks. The leadership of the FSB must do everything to provide additional support to the families of our fallen comrades.
Yeah, so losses in the ranks, that's what Vladimir Putin said. It's, again, a rare admission that there were any casualties at all, but it certainly stops far short of the admission of the tens of thousands of casualties it's estimated by US officials and others that Russia has actually suffered in this war so far, Wolf.
And those estimates probably are low. They're probably a lot higher than that. Matthew Chance, thank you very, very much. Let's get more on tonight's very high-profile hearing on the threat from China. We're joined by Congressman Ro Khanna. He's a Democrat who serves on the newly created House Select Committee on China. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. I know this hearing is supposed to begin in the next hour. Amid heightened tensions over potential Chinese support for Putin's war, the Chinese spy balloon, COVID origins, and a lot more, what do you see as the top priority in tonight's hearing?
Wolf, two things. One, we need to rebalance our economic relationship. Our manufacturing jobs left for China. We need to bring them back. Second, I just got back from Taiwan. We need to make sure that Taiwan has the defense capability to have strong deterrence from China ever having a military invasion there.
One of the witnesses who will testify tonight, Matthew Pottinger, we heard in Jessica Dean's report, is expected to play a video using Chinese President Xi Jinping's own words to warn that China wants to spread autocracy and upend the international order. Is that how you view the threat as well?
I believe that Xi Jinping has escalated the tensions, but I do think that if we have defense capability enhancement in Taiwan and continue to engage, that we can avoid war. One of the things we have to be aware of is Xi Jinping has met Putin 30 times in the last 10 years, more than any other foreign leader. He's said Putin is his best friend, so we need to figure out how do we separate Putin and Xi Jinping's alliance.
You're a new committee chairman, Republican Mike Gallagher, this new select committee on China, says tonight's hearing won't focus on the origins of COVID after the U.S. Energy Department assessed it likely emerged from a lab leak. What questions, Congressman, do you have about that report, and when can we expect a hearing on that issue?
Well, I want to know what the full truth is. One thing we do know is we shouldn't be censoring people who did say that it could have leaked accidentally from a lab. Obviously, that seems a plausible theory. Right now, we have different theories from different agencies. We need to get briefed as Congress, and there needs to be one consensus view of the administration on what happened.
When it comes to Taiwan, and you recently visited Taiwan, I know you want to maintain the status quo. But is that really possible considering one U.S. military support to Taiwan and China's own ambitions to control the island?
Well, it is possible as long as we're beefing up defense. When we met with the president of Taiwan, she has increased conscription from 4 months to 1 year. So every 18-year-old in Taiwan is now going to serve for 1 year. That's supported by all parties. She very much wants the $18 billion of anti-aircraft, anti-ship missiles. We have a backlog. We need to get it to them. But at the same time, she and all the parties emphasized that we need to continue to engage China to avoid a war. Deterrence plus some form of engagement, I think, will avoid conflict.
The House Foreign Affairs Committee chairman is fast-tracking legislation that would make it easier for the United States to ban TikTok over concerns about its Chinese parent company. Is that something, Congressman, you would support?
I support a forced sale. I don't think you can ban millions of users from using the app. You'd have a mutiny of young people in this country, but it should be an American company or an American ownership. It shouldn't be controlled by the Chinese Communist Party.
Congressman Ro Khanna, thanks so much for joining us. We'll be watching that hearing later and see what happens. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Wolf.
Just ahead, the fate of one of President Biden's signature domestic programs is now in the hands of the United States Supreme Court. Plus, Fox News facing new questions tonight after court filings revealed a stunning admission by the network's chairman, Rupert Murdoch.
You've got to ask yourself today in 2023, just where is the relationship between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and indeed Northern Ireland and the rest of the world today? Because it's certainly come a long way from back in the 60s. And just exactly what sort of influence does the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP, have over the progression of Brexit? The new EU-UK agreement was announced on Monday this week, and we saw the British PM, Rishi Sunak, attempting to make Northern Ireland, and he actually claiming that Northern Ireland was now the world's most exciting economic zone. It's, as I say, it's a long way since the tension in Northern Ireland in the 50s and 60s. Our expert on international affairs, Dr. Keith Suter, is on the telephone. He joins us now. Dr. Keith, a very good morning to you. I guess before we go forward and you tell us what the future is, we've got to have an understanding of what happened with Northern Ireland and its relationship with the UK.
Yes, so I think you need to start in 1973. So exactly 50 years ago, Great Britain decided to join what is now called the European Union. In those days, it was called the Common Market. And the Republic of Ireland, which was a much smaller economy than it is today, the Republic of Ireland said, we've got no choice. We've got to follow Britain into the European Union, the Common Market. And then in the last 50 years, the Republic of Ireland has really flourished, partly under European Union funding. And so when the Brexit vote was announced in 2016, the Republic of Ireland said, well, Britain might be leaving, but we won't. We see our destiny as being within the European Union. That immediately caused problems. Nobody on the Brexit side really had thought through some of the fine print on what would arise out of Brexit. And Northern Ireland is a good example where no one had really given much thought. I think if you look at the Brexit vote, it was an English vote. The peripheral regions voted to remain within the European Union. So that's Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland.
Right.
Whereas it was the English who got the numbers. They were the ones who voted to leave, and they took the United Kingdom out. Now, the problem with Northern Ireland is that since there's been the peace deal a quarter of a century ago, things have really improved in Northern Ireland. Indeed, the places that you were referring to earlier, with the battlefronts that we had in Northern Ireland,
and the IRA.
The IRA and all the rest of them, they're now tourist attractions. And the members of the old IRA are busy writing their memoirs. So it's a completely new era in the last 25 years. And the fear was that the boundary between the United Kingdom and the European Union would need to be drawn through the Northern Ireland border once again. And so that would then revive the old tensions, because in the last 25 years, people have become accustomed to living in one country and then going to work in another country. And they do that. I can tell you, when you drive from Northern Ireland into the Republic, you don't notice that you've actually moved out of the UK into the Republic of Ireland. That's what a significant breakthrough we have had over the decades with both countries being in the European Union. Now it looked as though a new border would have to be created. Either you run the border down through Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which would keep Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom, but then create all the old border issues that we've had before, which then leads to violence. Or you draw the line down through the North Sea and, in a sense, say the border for Great Britain runs as far as the Irish Sea, and on the other side of the Irish Sea border, the Northern Ireland is now part of the Republic of Ireland.
Yeah.
And no one knew how you're going to square that circle. Boris Johnson simply said, we will ignore, in effect, the concerns of the Northern Irish. And I think a lot of people in England had sympathy for that point of view because they're sick of the fighting that went on in Northern Ireland.
Oh, my God. The fighting, it was a war. It was an absolute war zone.
Yeah.
And you tell me that the IRA now is completely placated. Is it? And writing their memoirs. Is the IRA active at all anymore?
Well, not the old IRA that you would have remembered from the days of what was called the Troubles. As I say, some of them have died, of course, old age. But what we've now got, as we saw with the recent tragic shooting a few days ago,
That's right.
of that Detective Chief Inspector in Northern Ireland, this is a group called the New IRA.
Oh, okay.
So it's a whole new generation coming through who are now using violence. And so this is the fear that we've got, that we're going to get a reopening of all of this violence once again. And so what Rishi Sunak has tried to do, which his predecessors like Boris Johnson and Theresa May and then Tessa, whatever her name was, they all failed.
Oh, Keith, you're cruel.
I know I'm cruel, but you remember she didn't last in office as long as a letter did.
No, she didn't. But you're quite. It's a very different world now that the things have changed between Northern Ireland and indeed Great Britain and the rest of the world. I wonder what Gerry Adams would think of all of this, who was, of course, the president of Sinn Féin, wasn't he?
Yeah, and of course Gerry Adams was a supporter of the peace process and one of those who benefited from the outbreak of peace in Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
And so what the problem then was, where do you draw the boundary? How do you monitor it? And for the people in Northern Ireland, they've had a hell of a year trying to work out what their relationship should be with Britain and with the European Union. Whichever way you go, you're going to be bogged down with red tape.
All right.
And so that's what the negotiations have been about over this so-called Windsor Agreement, which Rishi Sunak has negotiated. This week is a turning point for Rishi Sunak. Either his agreement will be seen as a masterstroke, in which case it'll help him get re-election in a couple of years' time, or it'll encourage his opponents, one of whom is Boris Johnson, to get the knives out and bring him down in the same way that previous prime ministers have been brought down by Conservative colleagues.
Yeah. Expert on international affairs, Dr. Keith Suter, is with us. Dr. Keith, just quickly, last week you and I spoke about the 1 year anniversary of the start of the war in Ukraine. I noticed that Zelensky is now saying to Australia, please bring your embassy back to Kyiv. Do you think that will happen?
Yes, and it's really embarrassing that we don't have...
Canada's back.
Yeah, everybody's back. Well, I shouldn't say everybody, but our Western allies are all back. And this is a bureaucratic struggle, as far as I can tell, in Canberra, with the work, health and safety bureaucrats saying you mustn't expose Australian diplomats to the risk of violence.
Is that a fair comment, though? I mean, are we exposing our diplomats and Australian citizens to danger?
I guess we are, but then if you're going to serve overseas, that's a risk you run. Oh, indeed, if you live in Sydney, you're running a risk. Come on now. I do not agree with those Canberra bureaucrats. I think we need to get our ambassador back inside the embassy, which, by the way, is shared with the Canadians already back in that building. And I think that we need to do that and overturn the concerns of the work, health and safety bureaucrats.
It's 1 year since it started. Another year has started. Another year has just begun. What sort of next 12 months do you foresee?
It'll be even more suffering in the coming year. The real violence will take place in the middle of the year when the ground is hard. The summer will have arrived in the northern hemisphere, ideal time for fighting. And so I fear that by that time, the tanks which Ukraine will have received from the West will have been fully up and running. The crews will have been trained for them. And, of course, by that time, Ukraine might have also got fighter aircraft from the West as well. So it's going to be a very brutal year this year, even worse than last year.
Oh, dear, oh, dear. All right, Dr. Keith, always good to talk to you. Dr. Keith's podcast is called Global Truths. It's on the Lister app, LISTNR.